In the spring of 1942, the world's largest fleet prowled the Pacific, its banners snapping crisply in the salt-laced wind. In every corner of the Imperial Japanese Navy, confidence ran as deep as the blue-black sea. Tokyo's war rooms pulsed with activity, officers hunched over charts, strategy boards bristling with colored pins, the air thick with the low hum of certainty. They had swept across the Pacific like a typhoon, sinking enemy ships, swallowing islands whole, and rewriting the rules of naval warfare. The pride of a nation shimmered behind every salute and every meticulously starched uniform. At the heart of it all was the carrier, the Imperial Navy's ultimate weapon. Massive, imposing, and bristling with innovation, Japanese carriers were considered untouchable fortresses. Commanders recounted stories of American floating airfields with a mix of scorn and amusement, their laughter echoing through paneled halls. Unstable, clumsy, too slow to launch, they'd say, waving off American designs with a dismissive flick of the wrist. The Americans, they believed, were still learning to crawl while Japan had already mastered flight. Officers swapped rumors of U.S. ships limping home, of pilots flying inferior aircraft off decks built more for show than for war. In smoky back rooms and bustling mess halls, the consensus was absolute. Japan's carriers were the best the world had ever seen. Their nation, at that moment, seemed destined to reign over every wave, every horizon. But pride is a dangerous companion. In their confidence, Japanese commanders overlooked the quiet churn of American industry, the restless innovation taking place thousands of miles away. As Tokyo's leaders toasted to their victories, somewhere in a cramped Californian workshop, new blueprints were drawn. Airframes lighter, engines stronger, tactics sharper. The waves of the Pacific hid more than just submarines and mines. Beneath the surface, change was coming, and while Japan's commanders celebrated their dominance, a silent transformation was unfolding across the ocean. A transformation that would soon upend every assumption and turn their laughter into stunned silence. What the Japanese couldn't see, what few in the world could yet imagine, was that the Americans were about to turn the very concept of naval warfare on its head. To outsiders, the early American aircraft carrier looked like an ungainly experiment, less a warship than a gambler's wager. Steel hulls stretched impossibly long and flat, flight decks exposed to wind, waves, and the unpredictable will of the ocean. Above the waterline, little protected these ships from the elements or enemy fire. Even within the U.S. Navy, there was debate. Some officers clung to the mighty battleship as the true backbone of sea power, viewing these floating airfields with suspicion, even derision. Yet on those bare, sun-bleached decks, a quiet revolution had begun. The first American carriers, like the USS Lexington and USS Saratoga, were born of compromise, converted from battlecruiser hulls, their very existence a product of treaty limitations and budgetary squeeze. Their armor was thinner than their Japanese counterparts, and their aircraft complements modest. Logistics were a daily struggle. Hangar decks bustled with sweat and improvisation, spare parts were in constant demand, and every launch or recovery felt like a small miracle. The flight deck was a dance floor for risk. Sailors braced against salt spray and the deafening roar of engines, hauling cables, guiding aircraft with colored paddles, and working round-the-clock shifts under a merciless sun. Accidents were common, and the margin for error razor-thin. Sometimes it felt like the ocean itself wanted to swallow us, one deckhand later recalled, but we learned to keep moving, no matter what. Yet, in that hardship, a kind of resilience took root. American carrier crews, many barely out of high school, quickly learned the choreography of takeoffs and landings, of bombs armed and disarmed, of fires doused and machines coaxed back to life with little more than grit and ingenuity. The ships themselves evolved. Catapults improved, elevators quickened, arresting gear became sturdier and more reliable. Commanders who'd once doubted these vessels now witnessed the unique power of mobile airfields, the ability to bring the fight anywhere, to project force where the enemy least expected. This flexibility, more than steel or speed, was the secret. Carriers could slip away under cover of darkness, regroup, and strike again from a new quarter by dawn. With every mile steamed and every sortie flown, the American floating airfields became less a liability and more an unpredictable, lethal asset. Still, the flaws were real and obvious. A single lucky bomb or torpedo could, and did, cripple or sink a carrier. Deck crews drilled constantly for fires, knowing one spark could spell disaster. Aircraft losses mounted in storm and battle alike. The Japanese, watching from afar, saw these setbacks, noting each one with smug satisfaction. But in their focus on surface weaknesses, the Japanese missed something crucial, something hidden in plain sight. It wasn't the size of the guns or the thickness of the armor that would decide the fate of fleets. It was adaptability, ingenuity, and the willingness to learn from every disaster, every near miss. American sailors, scrappy, stubborn, and overlooked, were quietly rewriting the playbook. What did the Japanese miss about these supposedly easy targets? Perhaps it was the restless energy pulsing beneath every routine, the hunger to improve, the refusal to accept defeat. As Japanese intelligence officers compiled their reports, charting tonnage, speed, and armament, they could count the ships, but not the spirit of the men who sailed them. And so, as the war raged on, Japanese analysts found themselves peering at grainy photographs and intercepted communications, convinced they saw the whole picture. But the real threat, the one that would turn the tide of war, remained just out of sight, hidden within the heart of every floating airfield, steaming silently toward destiny. What exactly did Japanese intelligence see when they scrutinized these American carriers? And more importantly, what did they fail to see, and why? In the months after Pearl Harbor, a new myth hardened within the ranks of the Imperial Japanese Navy. A myth shaped by victories and forged in pride. Japan's admirals spoke of their carriers not just as ships, but as floating palaces of steel and honor. The Kido Butai, their formidable carrier strike force, was the envy of every navy on Earth. With decks stacked high with nimble Zero fighters and lethal dive bombers, these supercarriers had carved a path of destruction from the South China Sea to the Indian Ocean. Every engagement fed the legend. Japan's carriers were invincible. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the Navy's brilliant, enigmatic commander-in-chief, saw aircraft carriers as the future of naval warfare. He envisioned a fleet that could strike swiftly, unpredictably, and with overwhelming force. Under his guidance, Japan invested heavily in carrier design and pilot training, creating an elite cadre of aviators renowned for precision and daring. The pride in Yamamoto's voice was unmistakable whenever he addressed his captains. The fate of nations rides on your wings. Yet even Yamamoto, for all his foresight, could not insulate his fleet from the arrogance taking root among his officers. Commanders boasted openly in wardrooms, recounting stories of American carriers that scattered at the first sign of a Japanese task force. "Their ships are floating coffins," one captain declared during a celebratory dinner, raising his glass to laughter and applause. "Give us a day at sea, and we'll send them all to the bottom." This sentiment echoed through Tokyo, fueling the nation's belief in its naval supremacy. Radio intercepts from this period, later decoded by American intelligence, captured the swagger and bravado of Japan's captains. One famously declared, "The Americans hide behind their flight decks. They do not understand the true art of war." Even intelligence analysts, usually reserved in their assessments, described U.S. carrier tactics as primitive and reckless, dismissing reports of American innovations as exaggerated propaganda. In the officers' quarters, maps of the Pacific were marked not with uncertainty, but with confidence. Our range is greater. Our pilots are better trained. Our carriers are faster and harder to hit, they insisted, pointing to the specifications of the Akagi and Kaga, their pride and joy. The technical prowess of Japanese shipbuilders was a point of national celebration. Newspapers printed illustrations of the newest carrier launches, and schoolchildren learned the names of fleet flagships by heart. Stories of individual captains only added to the legend. Captain Kichi Hasegawa of the Soryu, for instance, was known for standing atop the bridge during air attacks, calmly smoking a cigarette while chaos erupted around him. He once wagered with his officers that he could predict the exact minute an American squadron would break and run. He won the bet more than once. These men exuded an aura of untouchability, a sense that the ocean itself bent to their will. But this swagger had a cost. In their overconfidence, Japanese planners began to underestimate American resolve and ingenuity. Reports of improved U.S. air tactics or the development of new bombs and torpedoes were quietly dismissed. When American carriers slipped away from battles they couldn't win, Japanese captains read cowardice where there was, in truth, calculated adaptation. Even as cracks appeared, occasional setbacks, hints of new American code-breaking abilities, the overwhelming narrative was one of superiority. The very idea that the Americans could match, let alone outsmart, the Kido Butai seemed laughable. Their carriers, after all, were not just ships, but symbols of a destiny fulfilled. But destiny has a way of turning on those who ignore its warnings. As the calendar crept toward June 1942, the Imperial Navy made a fateful decision. They would draw out the American carriers at a small remote atoll called Midway. The plan was simple: lure the floating airfields into a trap and destroy them once and for all. Yet in their planning, they made a single, pivotal error. They assumed the Americans would act as they always had, blindly, slowly, and with predictable caution. At Midway, that belief would be tested and shattered. The same confidence that had powered their rise would blind them to the danger lurking just beneath the surface. But at Midway, a single carrier decision would haunt them forever. How would America answer this humiliation? What secret preparations were already in motion, hidden from even the keenest Japanese eyes? After the bruising losses at Pearl Harbor, the United States Navy faced a long, uncertain road back. The country's pride had been stung and its fleet battered, but beneath the surface, something extraordinary began to stir. American commanders, hard-nosed, inventive, and unbowed, refused to let defeat become destiny. In war rooms from San Diego to Pearl, new strategies took shape, born from the bitter lessons of early setbacks and the hard-won wisdom of men forced to adapt or perish. The first signs of change came at the Battle of the Coral Sea. Here, in May 1942, carriers fought carriers for the first time in history. The result was a chaotic, bloody stalemate. But the Americans took away something far more valuable than victory: knowledge. They saw, up close, the vulnerabilities of both fleets, the vital importance of reconnaissance, the deadly consequences of a single missed signal, and the catastrophic potential of surprise. For every mistake, every aircraft lost or deck set ablaze, American tacticians scribbled furious notes and refined their playbook. The myth of Japanese invincibility began to crack. Then came Midway, a name that would echo for generations. American codebreakers, hunched over static-laced intercepts in windowless rooms, pieced together enough of Japan's secret plans to anticipate the attack. It was a masterstroke of intelligence, but it was matched by the raw courage and improvisational genius of carrier crews. Hornet, Enterprise, and Yorktown set out into the vast Pacific, their decks bristling with planes and nerves stretched taut. The battle that unfolded was a crucible. Waves of American torpedo bombers were cut down with heartbreaking losses, but their sacrifice drew Japanese fighters down to sea level. High above, almost unnoticed, American dive bombers, low on fuel, behind schedule, acting on a sliver of luck, stumbled upon the heart of the Japanese fleet. In a matter of minutes, everything changed. Bombs tore through the decks of Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, igniting fuel and ammunition, transforming Pride into inferno. 4 Japanese carriers were lost that day, and with them, the core of the Kido Butai. The American floating airfields had struck a blow so swift, so decisive, that even Japanese survivors struggled to grasp its magnitude. The hunters had become the hunted, and the world took notice. But the revolution did not end at Midway. It grew stronger at Guadalcanal, where battered, exhausted carrier groups fought running battles that defied the odds. In these chaotic months, the U.S. Navy learned the value of relentless tempo, launching strikes by day, patching flight decks by night, always staying just one step ahead. Carrier task forces became roving packs, coordinating with submarines and land-based air to squeeze the enemy from every direction. American crews adapted, inventing new tactics on the fly. Deck parks to cram more planes aboard, coordinated attack waves to overwhelm enemy defenses, daring night operations that pushed both technology and nerves to the breaking point. Technology and human spirit fused. Radar, primitive and temperamental at first, became the eyes of the fleet, giving American carriers a deadly edge in detection and interception. Codebreakers, now legends in secret, kept feeding information that let admirals set ambushes and avoid disaster. On deck, flight crews and gunners learned to trust one another without question. Survival depended on seamless teamwork and calm under fire. Stories of heroism and ingenuity became the lifeblood of the fleet. Sailors, who had once doubted these ships, now wore their scars with pride. They remembered the sight of enemy bombs crashing through wooden planks, of friends lost to fire and steel, and of the adrenaline-soaked moments when everything depended on a single, perfect landing. But they also remembered the victories. The Japanese ships found and sunk at night, the enemy pilots shot down against impossible odds. The moments when outnumbered Americans refused to yield an inch. As the war pressed on, the world began to realize what the Japanese had missed. It was not just steel or firepower that turned the tide. It was adaptability, resolve, and a willingness to learn from pain. American carriers, once the object of ridicule, had become the heart of a new way of war. They carried not only planes and bombs, but the hope of a battered nation and the grit of thousands determined never to be caught unprepared again. Suddenly, the hunters became the hunted. But the biggest surprise was yet to come. Even as Japan reeled from one setback after another, American minds were working feverishly behind the scenes. In distant factories, on wind-blown test fields, and inside guarded hangars, a new titan was taking shape. A weapon unlike anything the world had seen, with wings that stretched beyond the horizon and engines that roared like thunder. The age of the carrier was about to collide with something even more formidable: the dawn of the B-29 Superfortress. What was this mysterious new giant, and how would it forever alter the balance of power in the Pacific? Far from the island battles and carrier duels of the South Pacific, in the heart of the American interior, a revolution of a different kind was quietly unfolding. At airfields and factories stretched across Kansas, Washington, and Georgia, thousands of men and women toiled day and night to give form to a machine that would soon become legend: the Boeing B-29 Superfortress. Its arrival would signal a shift so profound that even the boldest admirals could not have foreseen the consequences. The B-29 was more than just another bomber. It was the most complex aircraft of its age, an engineering marvel built to carry war farther and faster than anything before it. Its gleaming aluminum skin covered a labyrinth of innovation: 4 massive Wright R-3350 engines, a pressurized crew cabin to keep men alive at 30,000 feet, remote-controlled turrets that bristled with 50-caliber guns, and a bomb bay built to cradle the most destructive payloads of the era. In its final form, the B-29 stretched almost 100 feet from nose to tail, a flying titan that dwarfed the fighters and bombers that came before. But the road to the Superfortress was riddled with obstacles. Engineers wrestled with new alloys and untested designs. The engines ran dangerously hot. So hot, in fact, that entire prototypes were lost to fire, forcing frantic redesigns and sleepless nights. Every test flight felt like we were chasing the future with one hand and wrestling disaster with the other, one Boeing engineer later recalled. There were delays, crashes, and moments when the entire program seemed on the brink of collapse. Yet the vision refused to die. In the chill of dawn, test pilots climbed into narrow cockpits, hearts pounding, and coaxed the unproven machines into the sky. Some landings ended in cheers, others in billowing smoke and prayers for the men inside. But each setback became a lesson, and every hard-earned triumph brought the project closer to reality. Mechanics and ground crews, hands raw and uniforms soaked with sweat, worked around the clock, replacing parts, patching leaks, and improvising solutions with whatever was at hand. In factories, Rosie the Riveter and her sisters bucked rivets and shaped metal, fueling a war effort that knew no rest. As the B-29 finally rolled off the assembly lines, it represented more than a bomber. It was proof of American industry's relentless might and imagination. The aircraft's capabilities staggered military planners. It could fly over 3,000 miles without refueling, soar above the reach of most enemy guns, and deliver 10 tons of bombs to a target half a continent away. Its pressurized compartments allowed crews to fly longer and higher, protected from the freezing death that had claimed so many airmen in older machines. The Superfortress quickly earned the respect, and sometimes fear, of those who worked on it. Veteran pilot Robert Morgan, already famous for commanding the Memphis Belle, described his first B-29 mission as flying the future, a blend of excitement and terror at 30,000 feet. There was a sense among the crews that they were part of something world-changing, an audacious gamble with the fate of the war hanging in the balance. Yet the B-29's power came with new burdens. Maintenance teams groaned under the workload. A single mission required hours of preparation, and even small glitches could ground an entire squadron. The learning curve was steep and sometimes lethal. But camaraderie ran strong. Mechanics shared coffee and cigarettes in the pre-dawn dark. Pilots swapped stories of near misses and narrow escapes, and everyone understood the stakes. If the Superfortress could be made to work, it might end the war. As the first operational units deployed, the B-29 demonstrated its extraordinary range and payload, striking Japanese positions from bases so distant that the defenders scarcely believed the reports. Tokyo, once thought safe by virtue of geography, now lay within reach. Japanese intelligence, stunned by the bomber's sudden appearance in skies they'd long considered untouchable, scrambled to understand how such a machine could even exist, let alone attack with impunity. Whispers spread among American crews. Could this be the weapon to end the war? At home, newspapers ran breathless stories of the Superfortress, blending awe with patriotic pride. In barracks and briefing rooms, young men who'd grown up idolizing barnstormers and aces found themselves entrusted with a machine more powerful than anything their fathers had known. But the story of the B-29 was still being written. Even as its bombers ranged across the Pacific, planners and engineers began to consider something even more audacious. What if these mighty aircraft could be married with the mobility and surprise of the carrier fleet? Could the Japanese be struck from an angle they had never conceived, by a weapon born of American ingenuity and deployed from the very floating airfields they had once mocked? The answer would demand imagination, courage, and no small measure of risk. Yet with every mission flown, every target hit, the possibility grew more real. Could Japan ever see it coming? From the very carriers they had laughed at? And what would happen when the world's most advanced bomber met the sea in the ultimate test of strategy and daring? The stage was set for an operation so bold, it would make history. The sea was glassy and still on the morning the superfortresses prepared to launch. From the decks of America's mightiest carriers, crews moved with a sense of purpose that bordered on ritual. Every cable, every fuel line, every last rivet had been checked and checked again. Overhead, the vast silhouettes of the B-29s loomed impossibly large, so much so that even seasoned sailors paused in their work. Stealing glances at these mechanical leviathans as they squatted on decks meant for far smaller craft. It had taken months of planning and no shortage of daring. The logistics alone would have made lesser commanders balk. Clearing the flight deck, modifying arresting gear, calculating takeoff runs down to the last inch of steel. Engineers and flight officers had argued late into the night, pencils worn down to nubs as they adjusted every equation, every wind forecast, to ensure there would be just enough lift and not a fraction less. As dawn painted the Pacific with gold, the decks were silent except for the roar of engines being primed to life. Below decks, crews readied themselves for a moment that would pass into legend. Some men wrote quick letters home, folding them into pockets in the hope of a safe return. Others simply sat, eyes closed, replaying the training one last time. Every switch, every sequence, every heartbeat in sync with the plane. Commander Joseph "Red" O'Malley, chosen to lead the first wave, gathered his men for a final word. "There are eyes on us from every corner of this war," he said, voice steady despite the enormity of what was about to unfold. "Let's show them what the American spirit can do." As the sun crested the horizon, the first B-29 lumbered to the edge of the flight deck. A collective breath was held, not just on the ship, but across the fleet, and perhaps in every home that would later read about this day. The engines roared, the steel beneath shuddered, and the Superfortress hurled itself down the impossibly short runway, wheels barely missing the churning blue as it lifted into the sky. One after another, the bombers followed, the impossible now suddenly, blindingly real. The Japanese coast was just beginning to stir when air raid sirens shattered the quiet. To the defenders below, the very sight of the bombers was a nightmare. Reports had said that B-29s could only reach the homeland from distant, newly conquered islands. That they could come from the sea was inconceivable. Confusion reigned. Gunners scrambled to man their posts, officers barked orders into radios, and every eye turned upward, searching for an explanation as much as a target. In Tokyo's war ministry, the first reports arrived in fragments, unidentified bombers, multiple formations, no sign of land-based origin. Admiral Toyota, at the head of the Navy, stared in disbelief at the dispatches. "Impossible," he muttered, shaking his head. "This cannot be." But as the phone lines erupted with calls from cities hundreds of miles apart, the evidence became undeniable. The Americans had done the unthinkable. From the ground, witnesses watched as the bombers sailed overhead, their engines a low thunder that seemed to roll right through the bones. One factory worker later remembered, "We saw the sun glinting off their wings. It was as if the sky itself had turned against us." Anti-aircraft fire blossomed, black and furious, but the B-29s kept coming, higher and faster than before. Bombs rained down on key installations, factories, rail yards, fuel depots, all vital arteries of Japan's war machine. In the cockpits of the superfortresses, American crews fought their own battle, not just with flak and fighters, but with doubt and fear. "We were so far from home, so exposed," Navigator Bill Cross wrote in his diary. "But we knew what this mission meant. We knew history would remember." As bombs struck home, some men cheered, Others sat in stunned silence. For a moment, hope and exhaustion lived side by side. Back in the Pacific, sailors on the carriers watched the skies, counting each return. When the first bomber made its approach, battered but intact, a cheer erupted that rolled down the length of the deck. Every landing was a victory. Mechanics rushed forward, pilots embraced, and word spread like wildfire. Japan had been struck from the sea by the very floating airfields they'd once mocked. Letters home would soon try to capture the enormity of it. "We did what no one thought possible," one gunner wrote. "We showed them we could reach out and touch the untouchable." But for Japan's commanders, the day ended in chaos and despair. Meetings devolved into arguments. Blame ricocheted from one department to another. "They have broken the line," one admiral whispered, hands trembling. "What else have we misjudged?" Across the country, the myth of Japanese invincibility began to crack. Civilians, once confident in the protective embrace of the empire, now looked at the sky with new fear. For the Americans, it was more than just a tactical victory. It was proof that adaptation, resolve, and relentless invention could overturn any calculation, any certainty held by the enemy. In one thunderous moment, everything the Japanese believed about their supremacy was turned upside down. The carrier, once scorned, now stood as a symbol of American genius and willpower. Yet the cost was evident, too. Not every plane made it back. Some men were lost to the sea or the guns below, their fate a reminder that even triumph demanded sacrifice. Still, as dusk settled on the Pacific, the balance of the war had shifted, irreversibly, and the world would never be the same. Now, in the wake of fire and steel, the war's architects on both sides were left to confront the new reality, one where old assumptions no longer held, and where the future would be shaped by those who dared to imagine the impossible. As the smoke cleared and stunned silence settled over Japan, a single question lingered in every mind. What would the aftermath bring? And how would the wounds of this day change the course of nations? The morning sun rose on what would become one of the most consequential days in the Pacific War, though at first there was little to set it apart from any other. To American sailors, the decks of the carriers still shimmered with dew, and the sea's endless horizon promised nothing but uncertainty. But within the hearts of every man on board, there was a new weight, a quiet sense, that what they were about to attempt would be spoken of for generations. It was the day the world learned that nothing was untouchable, as the final checks were made and the B-29s were readied for launch. Officers and enlisted men alike carried with them the sting of past mockery. Years of being underestimated, dismissed as the weaker force, the floating airfields, derided by enemy commanders, had forged something deeper than pride. It had forged a resolve not just to win, but to upend the very logic by which their adversaries had judged them. When the bombers roared skyward, the sheer audacity of the moment was not lost on anyone. "There was a hush over the entire ship," recalled one sailor. Even the old hands who'd seen everything went quiet as the first B-29 thundered off the deck. We all knew we were watching history. Miles away, in Tokyo's Naval Command, the first scattered reports triggered only confusion, then disbelief, then panic. The idea that the Americans could send their largest bombers from the sea was an affront to everything the Imperial Navy had believed about its own dominance. News raced through headquarters and down to the smallest outpost. Japan's shield had been pierced. The carriers they had ridiculed had not only survived, but had become the engine of their deepest humiliation. The psychological shock was profound. Senior officers, so used to dictating the pace of battle, suddenly found themselves off balance, their calculations shattered. For years, they had measured American capacity and come up wanting. Now, the very metric had changed. Their best strategies, their proudest ships, their vaunted tactics All were vulnerable to a force they had failed to anticipate. The realization swept through the Navy like a cold wind. Arrogance had bred blindness, and the price was being paid in flames and ruin. For American crews, the day brought a surge of vindication and, for many, a reckoning with their own sacrifices. As bombers returned, battered but triumphant, men remembered the losses endured to reach this point. The decks set alight at Coral Sea, the desperate improvisation at Midway, the bitter nights at Guadalcanal. All of it had led to this. The pain of being mocked had not broken them. Instead, it had driven them to innovate, adapt, and fight with a fierceness that no calculation could predict. Yet the lessons of this day would stretch far beyond tactics and firepower. As news of the raid filtered through both fleets, it forced every officer and every government official to confront a new reality. Technological superiority was never permanent, and underestimating an enemy could sow the seeds of one's own destruction. The B-29s, flying from the very floating airfields once scorned, had become more than a weapon. They were a symbol of what was possible when will, imagination, and necessity converged. In the weeks that followed, the reverberations of this moment echoed across the Pacific and around the world. The Japanese Navy, once the unquestioned master of the seas, now faced the prospect of defeat, and the gnawing certainty that its greatest strength had opened the door to its undoing. How did Japan's greatest strength become their ultimate undoing? And what did America learn from the pain of being mocked? The answer, as sailors and pilots alike understood, lay not just in bombs dropped or ships sunk, but in the human ability to rise from scorn, turn adversity into invention, and shatter every assumption about what could be done. As the war moved toward its closing chapters, the story of this day would linger, not just as a lesson of strategy or technology, but as a legacy for all who would face doubt, ridicule, and impossible odds in their own time. The question now, what would the world do with the lesson paid for in blood and steel? In the quiet that followed the thunder of war, the Pacific's endless horizon became a mirror for hard-won truths. The ships that had once carried the ambitions and pride of nations now floated in stillness, their guns silent, their decks scarred by the memory of fire and steel. For both America and Japan, the end of the war was not merely the end of battle, but the beginning of reflection, a chance to reckon with what victory and defeat truly meant. Survivors from both sides would spend years piecing together the meaning of those days. Some carried letters in battered envelopes, written during lulls in the fighting, words of hope or longing that outlasted the noise. One American pilot, who had launched from a carrier's deck on that pivotal day, wrote home, "We were called fools and dreamers, but in the sky, with the world below in shadow, I realized that every man who's ever changed the course of history was once doubted." His letter ended with a quiet plea that his children remember not just his battles, but the price paid for peace. Across the ocean, a Japanese officer, once so certain of victory, confessed in his journal, "Arrogance blinded us. We believed ourselves invincible, and in that belief, we failed to see the strength in our enemy's resolve." For many, the war's end brought more than surrender. It brought humility, a hard-won respect for those they once scorned. Innovation, born of desperation, became the true legacy. The B-29s and the floating airfields they launched from were not simply feats of engineering. They were testaments to what is possible when necessity, courage, and imagination combine. The war's most enduring lesson was not about weapons or tactics, but about the danger of pride and the enduring power of adaptation. Those who laughed at their enemy would, in the end, be humbled by history itself. As the years passed, both nations rebuilt, not just their cities and industries, but their sense of what it meant to be part of the world. Former enemies would become partners in peace, bound by the shared scars of conflict, and the determination never to repeat the mistakes of arrogance and underestimation. In schools and homes, stories of the war would be told not as tales of hatred, but as warnings and inspirations, a reminder of the cost of hubris and the possibility of redemption through understanding. Now, as the memories of those battles fade with each passing year, it falls to us, the inheritors of their world, to remember, to tell the stories of those who fought and those who fell, to learn from the ashes and honor the lessons written in wake and loss. For history, if we let it, can humble us all and guide us toward something better. The story does not end here. What will we do with the wisdom they earned? The answer lies in how we choose to remember, and in the stories we pass on to those yet to come. Thank you for joining us on this remarkable journey across the waves and through the clouds of history. The story you've just witnessed is more than a tale of ships and bombers. It's a living testament to courage, resilience, and the power of the human spirit in the face of impossible odds. As we remember the day arrogance was humbled and ingenuity triumphed, we're reminded that history is not just written by generals and admirals, but by every individual who dared to hope, to sacrifice, and to dream of something better. If this story stirred something in you, we invite you to share your own family's memories and connections to World War II in the comments below. Each story, whether of battle or survival, of loss or homecoming, adds another voice to the great tapestry of history. You never know whose life you might touch, or whose story might inspire someone else to look deeper into their own past. Don't forget to subscribe for more dramatic, untold legends from the world's darkest and most illuminating hours. We have many more stories waiting just beneath the surface. Hidden acts of heroism, unlikely alliances, and secrets that changed the fate of nations. What other secrets lie buried beneath the waves of history? Join us to uncover the next legend, because sometimes the greatest mysteries are the ones still waiting to be told. In our next episode, we'll journey to the frozen forests of the Ardennes, where a desperate stand changed the course of the war yet again. Until then, keep questioning, keep remembering, and keep the stories alive. The past is never truly gone, as long as we continue to seek, to share, and to learn.